Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Welcome to the Prose and Cons podcast, a podcast by emerging writers for emerging writers. Today I am Matan. I am actually Matan every day, but today I'm also your host. And today we got an episode all about spooky, misunderstood, and terrifying monsters. We have some very interesting writers with us today. In no particular order, Alex Eldridge.
Hey, my name's Alex. My author name is A.R. Eldridge, and I've written a collection of short stories named Golden Hour. And I also have a story coming out in the upcoming issue of the fiction issue of The Big Issue.
Hi, I'm Paddy Boylan. I teach writing to young people, and sometimes I find the time to write. In theory, I'm writing my first book. I like, what do I like? Science fiction and political thrillers. We'll say that for now.
Hello, I'm James Healy. I'm a freelance editor for blogs, novels, and scripts, and I like to write horror and science fiction short stories. I wrote Cooling Engines, and I'm currently working on my first novel.
And I'm Matan Elul. I write fantasy and light horror. I wrote the stories Our House and Glyphlight. Glyphlight is part of the New Mythic anthology. And I also teach English. And by the way, if this is your first time here, first of all, welcome. Second of all, we are part of Precipice Fiction. This is our official podcast. And we write stories. You can find them on many places, namely our website, but we'll talk about that later. Welcome to our episode about monsters. Guys, I hope you're ready to scare our listeners and each other, or maybe teach them about the fragility of monsters. But before we talk about that, we like to ask each other, what have you been reading recently that's worth mentioning? Paddy, you go first. What have you been reading recently?
Oh, it's quite good indeed. I've been reading Imperium by... Help! Robert Harris. I've been reading Imperium by Robert Harris. I said on a previous podcast that he is a historian. I'd like to amend that. He is not a historian. He's a journalist with a keen interest in history. It's set in the Roman Empire, and what's wonderful is even though he's historically accurate, it's very, very relatable. It's about like the halls of power. It's about like the political dynamics of like democracy at the time. It's about very dirty politics. And you're reading going like, oh yeah, this feels real. Yeah, we haven't changed. We haven't changed in 2,000 years. Highly recommended.
Nice. James, have you got something nice that you've been reading or watching or playing?
Yeah, I've been reading Children of Men by P.D. James, which everyone might know as a film. It was adapted into a film, I think so far with a completely different storyline, although the setting is the same. The setting is England about 20 years after the last human being has been born on Earth, and we've suffered from infertility. No more people are being born. So both of the stories are very bleak and very fatalistic. But I think the film takes it in a more hopeful storyline, whereas the book seems to be staying in that kind of apathetic, fatalistic way. But I will report back when I finish that on how the overall story goes. I'm only about halfway through it now.
Very nice. Alex, what are you up to?
I've been still reading the biography of Warren Buffett. I've been going through that, which has been interesting. But really, what I've been doing is playing a lot of Doom Eternal, which is full of monsters. So many monsters. It is chock full of monsters that you can meet and kill. That's
it's
what
very
I've been doing a lot of. Very lore heavy.
It's very interesting that you use the word meat. Like, what do you mean meet a monster and do?
MEAT is what he means.
Yeah, meet and slay them. That's right. Thank you, Paddy. No, I just mean you kill a lot of monsters. There's a wide variety of enemies that you can see, but they all need to be slain. And you slay them in a glorious bloodbath-y fashion. It's great.
Well, we'll get back to that. Thank you, guys. Me personally, it was kind of an inside joke sometimes last year when we asked each other, what do you read? And I think it was Paddy who always your answer was Moby Dick, right? For like, it felt like eternal, like for
Yes,
10,
it did.
11, 15 episodes. It was like,
Yeah.
Paddy, what do you mean, Moby Dick?
I
And
still
always
wake
kind
up
of
screaming.
squirming.
Yeah.
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 And I feel like I'm in that role. I've been reading Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light, which is the third book in the Wolf Hall trilogy. I've been reading it for so long. I've been reading it very slowly. I do love it, but I'm still going through it, and I do highly recommend it. It depicts the life and misery of the advisor of Henry VIII, Thomas Cromwell. And if you guys are looking for a long and great read, pick it up, guys. All right, back to our subject. Today we are going to discuss monsters in books, comics, video games, basically monsters in literature, in any sort of storytelling element. And before we jump into the question, I just wanted to do a run through of what a monster is. Is a human whose actions are deplorable, can we consider that a monster? Perhaps, but what we're here to discuss, seeing that this is a speculative fiction podcast, is the more supernatural element of monsters. We're not here to discuss monstrously behaving people, though some of them could qualify as real monsters if they have that supernatural element. We're here to discuss the monsters that are not exactly human. So, Jaws, does the shark constitute a monster? Not exactly. Is it supernatural? Depends on who you ask. Borderline. But normal animals like the bear in Revenant uh, is not supernatural, therefore it does not qualify for our discussion. For those of you that don't know, speculative fiction is fantasy, horror, sci-fi. That's the monsters we're going to discuss. And we're going to discuss the roles of a monster in your writing. And since this is a podcast for writers, we're going to ask ourselves, when do we need a monster? What does a monster give your story? And how do you craft the best monster for your story? So just to start up, guys, I'm going to ask you, are there any monsters you've read about or watched that have particularly impressed you with how much they added to the story they were part of?
Yeah, I'll jump in and say one. I'm gonna say for those of you keeping score at home, I'm gonna be leaning a lot on the Godfather horror this one. And the big one, I think probably my favorite monster. Actually, both there's two favorites, but I'll just say the one that I really like now is from the novella, or it might be a short story. It's somewhere between. It's longish, but not super long. Maybe like 10,000 words. Is from the short story 1408. The writer of 1408 is Stephen King. And the first half of it is just literally the protagonist, who is like a journalist. He's like a hack journalist, discussing with the hotel manager, basically, and the hotel manager was like pleading with him not to go and spend the night in this hotel room. And it just really ramps up the horror. But the monster itself is just truly terrifying. It's one of the very few things I've read or listened to an audiobook that I like. There was like a bit of a jump scare. Like it's almost like it's that classic Lovecraftian thing that like words could not describe how terrifying. Like that's the feeling it evokes in me. Like it's actually written very well. Like words obviously do describe it, but it's just this. Like it's not so much a creature as a presence. It is like the room itself. And it's just really, really terrifying. I'll probably touch more on it later.
This is choosing the Overlook Hotel as a villain all over again.
It
You gotta
is.
stop
It
choosing
very
buildings,
much
man.
is.
You
Yeah.
can't choose a building every time.
No, but that's the thing. Like the reason why I like monsters like that is that the idea of a thing, like a big wolf thing chasing after you or whatever, it's fine. It's spooky. But the idea of being like physically ensconced in something or consumed by something or something that you can't really fight back against, I find infinitely scarier. So that's why I kind of the things that I pick as monsters tend to be a little less tangible or a little bit more abstract.
I really support that. I love the idea of setting as monster. It kind of draws in the idea of it being something we can't understand, like a fly stuck in a web. And then the spider is the monster, but it's the overall web. That is what you understand of the situation. So I like that idea. I think that's a very good type of monster.
So I gotta ask because I really understand what kind of monster you're talking about. And just for our listeners, Alex is really describing here a monster that cannot be properly described. Now, that can work in books pretty well because words are abstract and vague. Sometimes in other medias, it's kind of hard to portray these kind of monsters. One that comes to mind is in the movie Annihilation with Natalie Portman. I'm not sure how many of you have watched it, but they really try towards the end to encapsulate this indescribable entity. And I thought they had a fair crack at it, and I recommend listeners to at least go on YouTube and try to look at it. But Alex, how would you give if a writer wants to write something that cannot be described, how do you go about it? Like how do you create that vague presency horror?
Well, I would not describe it as indescribable. If you look at the two TV tropes thing, absurd horror, it uses this as an example. Like the one thing that stuck out to me is the guys in the thing and the walls are melting and shit, and like the portraits are turning it, like there's all these very strange things happening. But the scariest thing is the phone rings and he picks up the phone and there's just this alien voice, and he describes the voice really well. I won't try and quote it, but he's like 5, 5, 5, all your friends are dead, 5. It's just this really weird, and he's like 6, 6, it's coming, like just this really strange abstracted way of being like of counting down, and then the numbers start doing like it's very unsettling. So I guess what I'd say is I would use something that was abstracted in the same way that I was trying to bring it across there. It's almost like a leap of logic, something that doesn't quite make sense logically, but emotionally has a very visceral impact. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like you need to describe it by adjacent details.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you guys, this is like a little bit of a tangent. Do you guys know dark matter? Anyway, dark matter is we can't detect it with light, but we can detect it by like the gravity that it puts out.
Negative space. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that's the way you describe like indescribable monsters. You describe the other stuff around them. You describe like the impact that they have.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
That is also the tool if you're leaning into a horror monster. That is also the tool they say that you should try and describe the monster by like the trace of its presence, the sound and the smell, and not necessarily have it rock right up and describe it in detail, but describe the effect of its movement through the space, or even if it's a house or something, you're describing it, the way it impacts the characters and how it makes them feel and stuff like that.
Yeah, use of negative space.
Huge. That's excellent stuff. Paddy, have you got a monster for us?
So I'm going to be a little bit contrarian, Matan, because you said a monster cannot be supernatural, but I
said
just to be okay. All right.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna choose the giant squid because the giant squid is like one of those. You're laughing.
Wait,
man,
the real giant squid?
Actual giant squid that has made its way into. I mean, like how many like Lovecraftian quote unquote monsters now have like writhing tentacles from the depths? You never get a good look at it. You know, in the days of yore, if you didn't know what a squid was, it would have been absolutely terrifying. And this becomes like Matan, I could see the look on your face, man, but hear me out. These kind of things, these kind of like other beasts, like especially from like the dark age of human history, not the dark ages, but the time of like prehistory, these would be the seeds that become monsters later. This is this terrifying thing that it's only like rumored to exist. And that is what other like fictional monsters become, like an elephant, right? Like, what the hell is an elephant? That's probably like the source of like other stories about the chimera. Okay, well, thanks. We know it. Well, yes.
I will allow it. No, giant squids are, I think that they have been rare enough in terms of their sightings that they could be considered almost unreal. Because how many people have physically seen a giant squid in this life?
Well, yeah, but to us, like a giant squid, we can like Google it, but again, like to our ancestors, the giant squid would have been a mythical terror that would only be whispered about in dark tales.
Fair enough. Giant squids from the book Reality. Thank you. James, go ahead.
I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and choose two, but they're kind of two examples of the same thing that the author Dan Simmons does. One of them is the polar bear from The Terror. The Terror is a novel in which a bunch of English sailors get landlocked within ice as they're trying to make their way through the Northern Passage. Basically, the water just freezes around the boat, and they get stuck there for like 2 or 3 years. And during their time that they're stuck there, a polar bear begins burrowing through the ice and trying to dig its way into the boat, and the snow that falls on the edges of the boat allows the polar bear to come up and even...
A normal polar bear?
Well, it is... That's the thing. It is interpreted by the sailors as possibly something supernatural. So either some of them think of it as the devil, or some of them think of it as a kind of yeti or an auroch, something that's based on the culture of the kind of the people who live in that region. So the characters interpret it as something supernatural, which allows the reader to have different interpretations of the story. In Dan Simmons' other novel, Hyperion, there is a creature. You knew this is coming.
I knew it. I knew where you're going with sentences. Go ahead.
There's a presence on the planet Hyperion, which horribly murders people, and this religion forms around it, where people, typically suicide cases and sadists and people like the sadomasochists and stuff, join this religion where they believe this being or this creature is like the god of pain and atonement. And the idea is that it basically collects people and takes them away to torture them and stuff, but that it also grants wishes. And all of the religion and all of the culture around this creature is just unapologetically sadistic. But the characters that the novel follows aren't part of the religion, but find themselves in a situation where they have to travel into the region where this presence is active. And they begin kind of debating, how much do we believe in this? And do we think it's going to grant wishes to us? Do we also think we're all going to die horribly? And both of those examples I really, really love, because it's more about how do people interpret what the thing is, rather than exactly what the thing is. So it allows for the reader to bring in their own interpretations of stuff as well. So those are examples of monsters that I love.
I wanna deep dive into your second example for a moment, if that's okay. Let's look at it from a technical standpoint. What is the point of view from which we learn about that creature? And is it narrated in the first or third person? Like, how close are we to the thoughts of the person describing it?
We are within, where it's third person, so we're within
Third person.
a third person character who has seemingly encountered this thing before, but isn't giving us the full details of that experience right away. And when this character meets the other 5, 6, or 7 characters that he goes on the quest with, they all just sit down and have a little conversation about, is anyone part of this religion? Does anyone believe in this thing? And then as the story develops, each of the characters tell their own short story about why they're involved in a situation. And each of the stories involves, well, I don't want to say too much, but the thing comes up in each of the stories. So a picture gets built piece by piece of it, but we kind of get the religion on the front end. So we get all of the lore about this creature first before it starts interacting with the story.
And it's based on the Canterbury Tales, I believe.
I think it is. It's some way inspired or some way, and I don't know what the Canterbury Tales are. But I know they
story of the soldier, the story of the bard. I believe it follows. I haven't read Canterbury Tales either, but I've been told it mirrors those stories.
Okay, great. I really think that when it comes to monsters, our point of view is almost like our camera angle, because depending on who's telling you what the monster is and what it looks like, it really paints our understanding of the monster. Jumping off of that, I just want to bring something up. Let's take any standard run-of-the-mill monster. Let's take, for example, the ogre. Okay, we all have a different image in our mind when we think about an ogre. Maybe you picture Shrek, maybe you picture something out of Greek mythology, maybe it's just a very large orc. But let's take this ogre for a second, listeners, be with me on this, and let's put him in different scenarios and see how they affect his role in the story. Let's say your story is a knight who wants to marry a princess, and the king tells him, sure, I just got that problem you could take care of for me. There's an ogre over by the bridge, get rid of him. and you get the princess. In that case, the ogre is a challenge, an obstacle, something that our little knight has to overcome. Let's take it to a different angle. Let's say the hero of the story is a villager whose family was murdered by an ogre. Suddenly, the ogre becomes the villain of the story instead of a challenge. Now let's change the point of view a bit. Maybe it's first person and we're with the character while the massacre is happening. Suddenly maybe it's more of a horror element. Suddenly maybe it's a monster like ogre and we're more scared. It's not about revenge, it's more about survival. You really can take this same creature and depending on your quote unquote camera angle, how you present him, you can have very different roles for your monsters. So what I want you guys to tell me is in your writing, and you can jump into other writing of other books if you'd like. How have you used monsters? What roles have you given them? Can I push you, Alex? Because you wrote a bloody good story with a lot of monsters in it that's published, and we can spoil the hell out of.
That's true.
Tell me about the monsters in Town Hall Steps without spoiling too much, since our readers might pick it up, our listeners. But
Okay.
how did you use monsters in that story?
Well, a technique I always like to do is, I think a monster in the style that I write specifically, a monster is always functional more as a framing device than as a focal point of the story. That story is not, it's a zombie story, but it's not really about zombies. It's really about the relationship between these four, like, you know, basically adolescents. Like that's what it's really about. It's like, you know,
Teenagers.
it's like they're teenagers basically. They are teenagers, maybe like early 20s. But so the zombies that are in it become the they become the catalyst for how these four people interact with each other and how it affects their relationship over a short period of time on this physical journey from one part of the city to another part. And the zombies basically, you know, inform how that relationship develops. And there's horror elements in it that heighten the tension, heighten the emotion. But yeah, they are a function rather than a character, is how I would describe them.
I love that.
Excellent.
That's a great use of a monster within the plot. That's really, really good.
Thanks.
I thought so too. I felt like in that story, they're really like clamps, you know, pressing the characters into a situation that's really bringing out the real them out. That exterior pressure, I thought was very well used in Town Hall Steps.
Thank you.
Yeah, very effective.
James, what about your wicked little things?
Yeah, I don't really have a consistent approach. I definitely like to tell horror stories involving monsters for sure, but I do kind of use it as the kind of nightmare at the end of the story that the characters are on a helter-skelter train track heading towards. I'm a big fan of, I guess, how H.P. Lovecraft structures a story, which is that the character, you know, is pursuing something, they make some kind of terrible transgression that puts them at odds with the monster or somehow within its grasp, and then they just can't seem to figure out in time how to get back into the safe world, the known world, away from the monster. And this was a bunch of jumps and scares along the way, and then the monster makes its big appearance at the end. That's a dynamic that I just love. I just think it's something that I love reading, and it's something that I really enjoy writing as well. So I think that's usually my approach with that.
I really liked your advice earlier about don't show me the monster, show me the footprints, show me the traces of the monster in the world. And I'm not gonna say the name of the story, but I think you know which story I'm talking about. But you've done that expertly well in one particular snowy setting, where we're just following. Yeah, we're following traces, and they're bloody terrifying until the very end. And just I think that's some of the greatest advice I've heard of, like, don't show me the thing, show me evidence of the thing. And I think that's a very good advice to take if you're going for the horror element of it.
Yeah, I think that is kind of the bread and butter of making a monster work, is to just figure out how did a character see evidence of the monster, how did the characters, you know, the idea of the monster almost getting the characters. It's kind of like it's kind of like Jaws' fin coming up out of the water, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Just those hints of that. As much as you can draw that out without it becoming, without losing its effect, I think that is the most effective way to do horror. And then, of course, there's people like Stephen King who can almost show his monster from the very beginning of the story, and continues having the characters fall afoul of the monster all along the way. But I feel like, as much as I love Stephen King, I feel like there isn't always the strongest fear element within those monsters throughout the story. Whereas I know in his short story, The Mist, he did that thing where the monsters get a few of the characters, but early on, the characters are kind of can't describe what happened because they were so shook, and it sort of just describes the vague details of kind of what it did to the person, and you don't really get a sense of like what it was. And I always find that kind of thing, that's what gives me chills, rather than, you know, the vampire jumping up out of the chair and their head is broken backwards and all that kind of thing doesn't really get me the same way.
Or like the whole movie Alien, right? I mean, the whole thing of Alien is you don't see the alien until the end.
Yeah,
it's the appearance and the psychology of it, and
once you see the creature, the game is over. It becomes an action movie then, you know?
Yeah,
like, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Aliens 2 is a great movie. But for me, it's not the same as that. Like, the suspense is the longer you can push the suspense, the more fun something is in a horror context.
Yes.
And that's what I kind of like out of
I was just saying, Alex, that's a very good point, that it becomes an action or an action story. It's kind of, it changes the tone right away, and now it's about, can the characters defeat the monster, and it becomes a little more, like you said, it kind of drifts into adventure after that point, like obviously a dark adventure, but it loses you lose the dread once you kind of know what they're up against.
It's a little bit weird. I wrote a story, Little Behemoth, and Behemoth is a monster from, I guess, old Jewish lore that makes its way into the Old Testament, I think. I haven't read the Old Testament. It's a big monster. It's a giant land beast that God created in prehistory. And then I've got these other monsters like Leviathan, which is like a big fish that God created in prehistory, and Ziz, which is like an enormous bird that God created in prehistory. But, okay, to sidetrack a little bit, we're having a conversation just before this. A monster is a thing that, and this sounds horrible to say, but we can slay it without feeling bad. I mean, Matan, before you were talking about like an ogre and the king sets a quest to go and kill the ogre. And you can have that in a fairy tale and be fine. But if the thing that the guy has to slay is like a dirty, crazy man who lives under the bridge, that's like, oh, we're killing him?
What do you mean?
Surely social services can take care of this. Or just like coloring them green makes them different.
Yeah.
So there's this thing about a monster which is other, that triggers our like fear and revulsion of the other, that kind of lets us do violence to it. I mean, that's kind of what video games and roleplay games are largely based on.
It justifies it. It makes it okay. They're no longer people, they're things. It objectifies it in a sense. And once something is no longer a person, it's a thing, it's fine. Like, no one's going to get mad if you destroy a chair. It's a thing, you know? Well, depending on whose chair it is, but yeah.
It depends whose chair it is. Yeah, and it's even worse because it's like a thing that is presumably trying to do you harm, so...
Yeah, exactly. So you're justified.
Yeah. So in this story, you've got... I'm trying to like turn that on its head. You've got humanity and they're advancing through the ages and they're approaching these biblical monsters, quote unquote, that God created, and they're slaying them in turn and they're jubilating in their slaying. But you're meant to feel like kind of sorry for the monsters, of these like grandiose beasts that have existed since like the creation of the universe are just being like so unceremoniously slaughtered by beings that are advancing through technology they don't have a chance against. This is a very long way of saying, it's fun to play with monster tropes sometimes, to turn it on its head. Absolutely. You know, like, well, maybe we should feel sorry for the monster. Maybe, maybe humanity is the real monster. You know, that old cliche. That's a fun thing to do.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think that's something. I'm going to say two things real quick. One is in our genre, you know, in speculative fiction, a lot of times our heroes get powers. Whether it's the ability to toss a fireball or to hit something really hard. And naturally, when we have a toy, we want to use it. You have the ability to cast fireballs. You want your character to burn something. Now, burning a human, maybe not for everyone. So what do? You craft this creature that doesn't feel pain and just grunts and groans, and that way you can show how cool your hero is. Which leads me to our second point, which is if we have a spectrum, and on one side we have the wild beast, the lion, the rhino, and on the other we have, let's take the orcs from Lord of the Rings. They can craft weapons, they can form an army. I think the awareness, like how aware, how close to human the creature is what's going to elicit either pity or jubilation from us. If you have something that is completely unaware, it's just a heavy beast lumbering about, then you know better than from a poacher. You're just killing a beast that doesn't know any better. But if you move the needle slightly to the middle, you have something a bit more, bloodthirsty, a bit more still animalistic. You still cannot reason with it, and that's important. You still cannot say, hey, please don't do this, that's not nice. And he's like, okay, Mike. Then you can kind of get away with, yeah, I killed it because it does have the awareness to be bloodthirsty, but no, it doesn't have the awareness to be negotiated with, therefore I didn't have a chance, I didn't have a choice. But if you take the needle all the way, then you just got, like, let's look at Skyrim, like lizard people, the Argonians, for anyone who's played the Elder Scrolls.
Of course.
They look monstrous, but you can have a beer with one of them. They're just like us. They just have scales and a tail and other things. So I do believe that where you put the awareness of your creature is what's going to make your reader either sympathize with the person slaying it, like, oh, he didn't have a choice, it was a chupacabra, it was going to eat him alive, it didn't have a choice, versus, oh wow, why did he kill that poor dragon that was just like living its life and laying eggs and flying around.
I mentioned roleplay games just before, and I want to mention them again because Dungeons & Dragons, etc., are chock full of monsters. There's this abstract way of saying basically whether things are goodies or baddies. So a monster could be like evil, and it could be chaotic evil. That's a type of evil. And this monster is, by its nature, it's going to do evil. Maybe it can't even do good. It has no conception of evil. And that means, like, when you see it, it's going to try and harm you in some way because that's its nature. That doesn't reflect real life. Like, animals are just animals, people are just people. But it's a green light for the players in Dungeons & Dragons to slay this monster. Don't feel bad about this. It's chaotic evil. If it's not going to kill you, it's going to kill someone at a later point. And I think, like, in horror, monsters are often just, like, almost elemental evil, right? They're not, like you were saying, Matan, they're not reasoning and they have no nuance. They're just like, they're there in the story to cause havoc and cause pain.
Or you are prey. Your character might be prey in the food chain. Maybe it's not even personal, like the shark from Jaws doesn't care who he is.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, I mean, that's, okay. That's like, say, no, I guess this isn't the same. I was thinking from the prey perspective, like, you could think of something like Predator, which is very reasonable, like, like so much to the point that at the end of the first Predator movie, the thing, I forget exactly what it does, but it basically throws down the gauntlet to Arnie to be like, let's duke it out. Like, let's fight this as an honorable
without
fight.
weapons.
But you feel
so cool.
like you don't feel bad for it because it's established this pattern of like, well, I'm just killing for the sake of killing, which is maybe on the other end of like something that just kills for the sake of killing because it doesn't know any better, but is still sort of the same thing, So I don't know. I might like disagree with that necessarily being that spectrum. I think it's a parameter that you can use.
I would definitely lean into the balance of the predator-prey dynamic. If you're leaning into a horror monster, that is, it is about displacing the human being as the apex predator and either depriving them of their tools of being top of the food chain or putting them in a place where they're isolated. They can't just call 911 and have police show up to help. And then presenting the monster as the thing which is then coming for them, and not even that it can't be reasoned with. It's just that you're its food, or you're something that it is coming for, that is hungering for, and that creates this sense of something that we find it very difficult to wrap our heads around now because we've been on the top for so long, and then suddenly when you start thinking about, imagine if I wasn't on top and there was something that could just come and stalk and hunt and devour me or take from me in that way, it
Yeah.
becomes very, very frightening all of a sudden. And the
Yeah,
notion
absolutely.
of trying to reason with that is terrifying, particularly if you realize that it can't be reasoned with, because it has nothing you want other than your flesh or your soul or
Primal,
whatever it is
yeah.
it's coming for.
There's something very primal in that, like playing armchair psychologist, which is fun. It almost feels like it's awakening something deep and dark within the human psyche, but it really does. It feels like, yeah, this is what our old ancestors would have felt when they're like hiding from the Smilodon in the cave. You know?
Sabertooth.
When you think of how much of our myths and stuff came from so long ago, when we kind of understood so little about the world, and when
giant squid, man, it comes back to the giant squid.
Squids making a comeback.
Yeah. Well, that's like what you said, Paddy, about the. I think this is funny. Like the tentacle thing is almost a shorthand for the ultimate other. Like it's not obviously tentacles are just, but it's like this. It's a shorthand for like, this is so beyond the like reasonable expectations of what you know. This creature doesn't even think like you. This doesn't even exist in the same dimension as you. It's just
it doesn't even have joints.
Little other thing, which I think is kind of funny. Like, oh, it's got squiggly things. That means it's like unspeakable evil. But like,
it doesn't have a spine. It doesn't have a spine.
The fact that we share the same planet with octopuses is just, or squids for that matter, it's just it's befuddling. They can turn bloody invisible. I feel like we have all leaned, with the exception of Paddy, we've leaned pretty hard into the horror element of a monster rather than the challenge element, the obstacle. Because for every action set piece, you need your hero to fight something. Now, unless you got, like baddies wearing black and following, the Lord of Evil, then they're probably going to be monsters, right? That's what you're going to fight. I want to take you to the challenge side of business, just because I feel like a lot of our listeners who write fantasy and sci-fi, they need their heroes to prove their mettle. How would you craft those little mini bosses, these action set pieces? What do you do to make it feel exciting and not just like, the hero's going to win? Power gap, what do you do?
I've got one. I think the ultimate, not the ultimate, but a very strong example of like the boss, the challenge monster would be Smaug from The Hobbit.
Ooh,
he's a big old dragon, and he's like sitting on a bunch of gold, right? But also he's totally sentient, and he talks to Bilbo, and like
I love that conversation.
It's the
so
best part of the whole book. And it's incredible. But he is the the epitome of like literally the dragon sitting on a pile of gold. It's it's one of the oldest tropes in the book, but like the way that encounter plays out is so rich,
So I've never read The Hobbit, and I saw the movie a long time ago. I actually liked it, unlike a lot of people. What is it about the talking that makes it effective? James, I know that's okay. But you said like he talks, and that makes it like more affecting. Like, what is it about Smaug talking that?
I would have to say that it's almost like a subversion of the trope, in that the whole book is set up as them going on this quest to kill a dragon and steal its gold. And I can't remember why Frodo is sent in, of all people.
Bilbo. It's Bilbo.
Sorry, wrong Hobbit. Yeah.
One of the hobbits. They all look the same anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Young Bilbo. Yeah, it's Martin. What's his name in the movie, right? First movie.
Freeman. Anyway, it is a subversion.
You're expecting him to go in and meet this evil dragon and either trick it or slay it or something, and he comes in and he has just a really. The dragons just feel so sophisticated and very intelligent, and they just sit and have a chat, really, and you're all of a sudden like, oh, this isn't going to play out the way I thought it was going to play out, and you've become really, even though what you expected isn't going to happen. I remember reading as a child and still being so invested in what was going to happen, how this was going to work out.
Well, that's why it's so impressive, because it's so unexpected. It's like, okay, I did not see that coming.
One of my favorite things about The Hobbit is that as you're reading the book, nothing, and I mean nothing about that group of people makes you think they are qualified to kill a dragon. They show no capabilities that at any point make you believe in them. Like, they lose to the trolls, the elves do whatever they want to them. They're just fighting over breakfast the whole time. They can't even get into the bloody mountain. These guys are supposed to handle a dragon, and then you see the dragon, and it's like the most intimidating thing. A part of it was like, okay, the dragon's gonna suck. That's the only way they're walking out of this. It's gonna be like this fat, stupid dragon. That's how they're gonna win. And this dragon is like top tier
Leagues above
dragon.
them.
You know, it's like
Yeah.
it's a very good dragon. I wish I had better vocabulary for this, but it's an excellent dragon. It's a very good dragon.
Definitely my top 3 dragons for sure.
Top.
Well, no, that was perfect. That was beautiful. But you were saying like what makes like a good monster boss fight? The power differential, right? You play out how powerful the monster is and how helpless the protagonist main characters are, and the gulf between those two presumably makes the fear and the challenge.
Yep.
Okay, but is that exciting though? It is comical. It is
It's
frightening.
exciting.
Very
Have you guys ever
exciting, yeah.
played? In fact, I know that you guys have, but I'm gonna ask anyway. Have you guys ever played like one of those horror survival video games where you don't have weapons? You just have like
Amnesia.
a flashlight that runs out. Yeah, I couldn't finish Amnesia. The fact that you're completely helpless against the monster, like if you had a gun, in
Yeah.
so much less frightening because you have a way of fighting back.
Resident
and even
Evil.
to score.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the fact that you just have a flashlight and you're literally helpless against them, all you can do is like hide in a cupboard and peek out. I didn't finish the game. I would never finish that game.
I uninstalled it within 7 minutes of starting.
You
Yeah,
laugh,
That's how
but-
bad it was.
On the other side of that, the game that I've been playing now, Doom, is like the complete opposite of that. Like
Oh, yeah,
the
talk to
monster
us
is
about
strong
that.
and big and scary, but
Yeah.
not as big and scary as you. You can just kill
Ooh.
everything. It's
You are the
All right,
monster.
let
it's
me.
obscene. It's like
let
it's
me-
its whole thing. Like so that's more
Let
of the action adventure side of it rather than the horror. Like
Alex, let me throw you into, for example, because I really want to take this into a novel, into writing. So let me take you to The Witcher. The Witcher. Have you watched the movie, played the games, read the books? Have you interacted with the universe at all? Who
all,
has?
unfortunately.
Anyone?
I
Okay, you play the games,
Yeah.
Paddy. I'm throwing this to you then. The Witcher is a good combination of like really freaking monsters, but you got a pretty sharp blade. So how does that make you feel?
Really good. Geralt's not afraid as a character as well. Geralt is the main character. He doesn't fear these monsters. Like in a way, he kind of is a monster himself. So the monsters, the fact that the monster is like these evil, really powerful horrors and you're just slaying them makes you feel like a badass.
Yeah.
So it's got all the trappings of horror and like gothic horror and stuff like that. But
But you got this.
really subverted. But you can play in that space
Yeah.
safely, which
Yeah, it's like Dark Souls. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
it is.
Imagine if you're facing down Cthulhu and then like someone puts a hand on your shoulder like, no, I think it's 50-50. What do you mean? No, I think it's 50-50.
You
You know,
got
just
this.
step into the water. I think maybe you got this.
you got this, brother. You got this. Yeah.
Yeah, like, look, just hit him in the tentacles. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
I
that's
only
part of it.
played the very beginning of one of the Witcher games where you hunt and kill a griffin. But when you're doing that,
Witcher
they
3.
humanize the griffin so much. They give you a lot of backstory about their relationships and how it's human beings that have routed the kind of griffin out of its home and done various things to piss it off. So it's almost like sad that you're doing it.
The game
I think
does that a lot. It's really
so
good
clever.
for
Yeah,
making
it's
you
really,
feel
really
the
good.
feels.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's well written.
Yeah, that's what I remember thinking was really well written.
Great. I'll just say about the way I use monsters in my writing. I'll talk about Glyphlight, the story that has been published, without spoiling it too much. I do like to have a power gap between the monster and the protagonist, but I don't want it to become to the point where the only viable solution is run. Because in a lot of horror stories and books and games, the only rational thing to do is escape. Or if there's an ancient artifact that can seal them away, you can do that. But for the most part, the power gap, I try to keep it just within reach. Like, you're probably gonna lose. But there is something you can do to walk out of this beyond just call the police and hide and I think that's the difference between straight out horror and more dark fantasy. It's like you gotta ask yourself, a lot of the times I believe people who like fantasy, it's almost like my favorite fantasy books are the ones I would like to live in. like the ones like obviously hands down Harry Potter number one. I would love to go to Hogwarts, stay away from the basement. But in fantasy, I do want to inhabit that world most of the time. Whereas in horror, I'm like, no, thank you, I'm good here. And I think that should be the difference. Like if I gave you the tools that the protagonists have, would you be fine in that situation, or would you just like, no, I don't want to be here? And I think that's the difference between having a monster that is like terrifying horror, get me out of here, and like, yeah, I'll be Goku for a day and fight Lord Frieza, because I know I can do this. So that's what I think about Power Gap.
I like that. It's giving them a chance, even if it's a slim chance.
My last question to you guys before we wrap this up is really try to get technical here. Like James, I really liked your advice earlier. Give me some good old-fashioned advice for writers developing their monsters, either for horror or just as a challenge for our heroes to look cool. What kind of advice you can say what to do or what not to do, but any advice would be appreciated.
I would say I always like to frame them in relation to the protagonists. What relationship does this monster have to the protagonist? Is it a monster for its own sake? I don't have much interest in that personally. You may, and that's fine. But I always like to pitch things in relation to the character, to the protagonist or the characters. What does this represent in terms of them, and how are they going to not even necessarily overcome it? It's just, what does it mean to them, and how is it somehow related to their life? I don't really know how to explain it any more effectively than that, but like, yeah, what does this mean to them, and how does it play into their journey? That's probably a way to think. Like, at what point in the journey does it occur, and for what purpose? That's what I'd say.
Do you mean like tie it to the arc of the character in some way, or do you mean frame it as an antagonist to the main character?
No, I mean more, how does it tie into the themes of the story is kind of what I mean. Yeah. How is this thematically relevant to the characters? That's, I always like to come at it from that perspective, because then I feel everything can be tied in nicely together, and it like, if you've got thematic resonance going through the whole thing, things just feel richer to me and more potent. So yeah, how can you thematically tie it to the protagonist?
Without spoiling anything, in your story, you have inhumane monsters and you have human protagonists, but I personally felt like there was a transition, a journey of some characters from humanity towards inhumanity. At least, maybe not literally speaking, but at least that felt like a theme that came out, so it matched with the monster you chose for your story.
Yeah, and that's a theme I like to play with a lot. Like, how dark does it get for these people if they're put in these terrible situations? Which is something someone pointed out to me, and I think is accurate. So, yeah, that might just be a personal thing, but yeah.
James?
That would actually have been kind of what I was going to say, in the fact that it does make it richer, if maybe not necessarily theme, but what does your monster symbolize, and what is the metaphor behind the monster, and how does that play into the story at large? I feel you can have great monsters and you can have great scares and stuff like that, but it's something that, like you said, makes it a lot richer, just gives more dimensions to a story. What are the metaphors behind the monster and what the monster is doing, and I guess sometimes how the monster looks, but in relation to more its presence and more its activities in the world. What is the metaphor behind that? I think that just adds an extra layer to a story that really steps the story up.
Nice. Babadook comes to mind. Has anyone watched that?
I've heard of it. It became a queer icon, like somehow, which I found amazing.
Interesting. Babadook is a
look up
movie.
Babadook.
The Babadook is the official name The Babadook or Babadook?
The Babadook. Yeah.
I think it's widely agreed upon that the monster, the titular monster, represents grief. Yeah. And how we deal with death. And almost like, again, I don't want to spoil it, but grief is something that sometimes should be embraced rather than ignored or tucked away, because that's not the way to deal with it. It usually becomes larger and scarier if we don't take care of it.
Or so like in Moby Dick, the titular monster in that. Moby Dick represents obsession and unto your own destruction.
Flight of Icarus.
Yeah. Paddy, what do you get for us?
I was going to say the same thing as Alex
No,
and James.
shut
So
up.
I have absolutely nothing new to contribute.
Nice.
So instead, I heard, take this with a grain of salt, because I mean, I haven't like verified this by looking up any facts or evidence, but who needs facts and evidence? I've heard this idea, like I guess a hypothesis, that you know how so many different folklores and cultures have these ideas of goblins or gremlins or spirits or like creatures in the forest that are often like little weird that are monstrous and you can't trust them and don't go into the woods, right?
Yeah, the Fae.
Yeah, exactly. Well, like the Fae. What if, like, so I keep talking about prehistory, but it's fun. What if in prehistory, like, we know that there were near human creatures. They were also like ape descendants that were intelligent, that formed tribes, that were like pretty different to us. And we shared the world with them at some point, and they would have looked just like us, but like different enough to be kind of uncanny and kind of uncomfortable. And because, you know, we can't reproduce with them, they also we're competing with them. What if all these ideas about like creepy little dudes that live in the forest come from those not quite humans that manage to fall by the wayside? It's a fun idea.
Yeah, that is
That we
fascinating.
killed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe
Fall by the wayside. I'm doing inverted commas. Yeah.
They couldn't compete in evolution.
Yeah.
Yes.
Neanderthals.
Compete with our boomerangs.
And then that's where they haunt us.
Fun idea. Maybe if anyone's listening,
it
you
is
can
cool.
take that idea and run with it in fiction form.
Nice. My advice is whatever monster you choose to put in your writing, whether you want it to be scary, intimidating, impressive, just respect it. Respect your monster. Treat it as a 3-dimensional character. Even if your monster is a bad spirit from 700 years ago, even in your head, if you know what tipped that spirit towards where it is, maybe it was the victim of something horrible when it was alive, I think that would round up your monster. You don't even have to always put it on the page, but you need to know what makes your monster click, move, and do the things that it does. And I think your monster will be better for it, and therefore your story. So treat your monsters with respect, even if their entire purpose is just to show how cool your hero is.
I think Princess Mononoke is a really good example of that, of like humanizing the monsters. I saw that recently, and I think that's a very, very effective example of that.
It's so good, isn't it?
It is. It's so violent. It's so, like horrifically violent.
Really
it's great.
violent.
It's really
They
good.
have a lot of blood in them. They have a lot of blood.
Yeah.
Maybe Tarantino made that movie.
Yeah.
sorry.
Maybe.
I do have a quote. I didn't run it by the group. I hope that's okay. It is a Stephen
It's
King
okay. I
quote.
can just edit it out.
Oh, yeah, you could. You got the power. All right. Here's the quote. It is by our Lord and Savior Stephen King. Is he our Lord and Savior? We like him.
My
We
Lord
like
and
him.
Savior.
Stephen, if you're listening to this, we like you. Monsters are real and ghosts are real too. They live inside us, and sometimes they win. That was a quote by Stephen King. A man with his fair share of ghosts. With that being said, we were the Pros and Cons podcast. We hope you guys enjoyed listening to our discussion about monsters. We will remind you that the new Mythic is available on Amazon.com if you guys want to purchase it. An amazing and extraordinary audiobook is in the makes, and it will come, especially if you like someone charismatically reading stories to you. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review wherever you consume your podcast. Much appreciated. Thank you. I was Matan. These are the lads. And have a beautiful day.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.